In 1963, General Motors made a decision that should have destroyed its muscle car program. No engine over 400 cubic inches in intermediate cars. While Dodge and Plymouth prepared to dominate the streets with 426-inch Hemis, GM's engineers were handcuffed by their own executives. Chevrolet's response, the 396, an engine that produced 425 horsepower, outsold every other GM big block combined and proved that bureaucracy couldn't kill innovation. This is the story of how corporate America's dumbest rule created one of its greatest engines. Inside the cloistered halls of Chevrolet engineering at GM's Technical Center in Warren, Michigan, journalists gather around a dyno cell. The air smells of hot metal and race fuel. Through reinforced glass, they watch a new engine fire for the first time under full load. The sound is unmistakable. Deep, mechanical thunder. Not the high-strung scream of a small block, but the confident roar of serious displacement. This is the turbojet 396, and it's about to rewrite Chevrolet's performance story. The engine settles into a steady 6,000 RPM pull, intake runners gulp air. Exhaust headers glow cherry red. The dyno readout climbs past 400 horsepower, then keeps climbing. When the run finishes, the L78 variant has just proven it can deliver 425 horsepower from 396 cubic inches, more than 1 horsepower per cube without forced induction or exotic fuels. But the numbers tell only half the story. Look closer at this engine and you see Chevrolet's engineers working within impossible constraints. GM's 1963 racing ban had included a corporate mandate. No intermediate car could receive an engine larger than 400 cubic inches. While Pontiac's GTO was bending rules with a 389 and Dodge was about to unleash the street Hemi with 426 inches of displacement, Chevrolet needed something that could compete without triggering corporate wrath. The 396 was their answer, exactly 4 cubic inches under the limit. The Mark IV big block family brought genuine innovation. Canted valve heads, borrowed from the experimental mystery motor that had terrorized Daytona in 1963, allowed massive valves and unprecedented airflow. The intake valves measured 2.19 inches on the L78. The exhaust ports were rectangular, not restrictive. The combustion chambers featured a wedge design that promoted efficient burn even at the stratospheric 11-to-1 compression ratio engineers had chosen. This wasn't a detuned race engine. This was a clean sheet design that incorporated everything Chevrolet had learned from the W Series 409, from NASCAR development, and from the abandoned Corvette Le Mans program. The block itself was engineered for strength. 4-bolt main caps secured the crankshaft. 7/16-inch connecting rod bolts replaced the smaller hardware used in earlier engines. The oil pump received a hydrostatic balancing system that equalized pressure around the gears, extending service life and maintaining pressure under racing conditions. Period magazine struggled to describe what made the 396 different. It wasn't just powerful, it was refined. Hot Rod's technical editor noted the intake manifold's 180-degree runner design, which balanced cylinder-to-cylinder flow more evenly than previous Chevrolet big blocks. The valve train used stamped rockers on individual studs rather than shaft-mounted systems, reducing reciprocating weight. Even the casting quality impressed. This engine was built to withstand punishment. In the Corvette, where it debuted as the L78 option, the 396 transformed America's sports car into a legitimate performance weapon. With a forged steel crankshaft, solid lifter camshaft, and aluminum intake manifold, the L78 delivered power that exceeded its conservative factory rating. Racers who dynoed these engines found closer to 450 horsepower at the flywheel. But the real revolution would come in 1966, when Chevrolet expanded availability beyond the Corvette and full-size models. The Chevelle SS 396 arrived as a mid-year introduction for 1965, then became a full production option for 1966. For the first time, buyers could order legitimate big block muscle in an intermediate platform, the very segment GM had tried to protect with its displacement limit. The engine bay of a 66 Chevelle SS barely contained the Mark IV, the air cleaner dominated the landscape. Exhaust manifolds, cast iron headers in Chevrolet parlance, routed spent gases with minimal restriction. The engine sat nose-heavy in the chassis, giving these cars their characteristic front-end bias and tail-happy handling. This was the machine that made Chevrolet competitive again. While it couldn't match the street Hemi on pure displacement, the 396 could be built cheaper, serviced easier, and drove more predictably. It became the everyman's muscle car engine, powerful enough to earn respect, accessible enough to be everywhere. Picture this, January 1963, the boardroom at General Motors headquarters. Executives are reviewing the corporation's involvement in motorsports, and they're nervous. Federal regulators are watching Detroit's horsepower wars with increasing suspicion. Antitrust concerns loom. The Automobile Manufacturers Association had instituted a racing ban in 1957, but most manufacturers had quietly ignored it. By 1963, GM's leadership decided full compliance was the only path forward. The directive came down. Effective immediately, all GM divisions would cease factory-backed racing programs, no more NASCAR teams, no more drag racing support, no more performance engine development aimed primarily at competition. But the corporate mandate went further. Some nameless committee decided that intermediate cars, those with wheelbases between 112 and 118 inches, should be limited to engines displacing 400 cubic inches or less. The rationale varied depending on who explained it. Safety concerns, insurance industry pressure, federal oversight, corporate image management. Whatever the reason, the effect was immediate. Chevrolet's racing programs shut down overnight. The W-Series 427 and 409 engines, which had dominated drag strips and won respect at Daytona, were suddenly off-limits for intermediate cars. The engineering talent that had developed these monsters found themselves constrained by rules that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with corporate politics. Meanwhile, across town, Chrysler Corporation had no such restrictions. Plymouth and Dodge engineers were developing the 426 Max Wedge into the 426 Hemi. These engines would produce 425 horsepower in street trim and dominate professional drag racing for the next 5 years. When a '66 Charger with a Hemi pulled up next to a Chevelle at a stoplight, the outcome was predetermined. Chevrolet simply didn't have an answer. The displacement ban created a strategic disaster. GM's intermediate cars, the GTO, the 442, the Grand Sport, the Chevelle, were locked into undersized engines during the exact moment when the muscle car market exploded. These were the years when baby boomers were buying their first performance cars, when quarter-mile times mattered more than fuel economy, when cubic inches equaled bragging rights. Pontiac's response came first. John DeLorean, serving as chief engineer, orchestrated what amounted to bureaucratic civil disobedience. He took the division's 389 cubic inch V8, fitted it into the intermediate Tempest, and created the GTO. Technically, this violated GM's displacement limit. The original rule had been 330 cubic inches for intermediates. But DeLorean marketed it as an option package rather than a standalone model, skirting the regulations through clever positioning. The GTO's massive sales success forced GM to revisit its own policies. By late 1963, the corporation quietly revised the displacement limit upward to 400 cubic inches. This gave Pontiac breathing room, but still left every division at a severe disadvantage against Mopar. Chevrolet's engineering team knew they needed something special. The old W-Series engines were heavy, dimensionally large, and expensive to produce. A new design was necessary, something that could maximize power within the 400-inch constraint while being light enough, compact enough, and affordable enough for mass production. Development of what would become the Mark IV Big Block began in 1963. Engineers studied the mystery motor that had shocked the racing world at Daytona. They analyzed the W-Series engines to understand their limitations. They consulted with racers who'd pushed these engines to destruction on tracks across America. The mandate was clear. Build the most powerful engine possible that stayed under 400 cubic inches and could be manufactured at scale. The solution was 396 cubic inches. A 4.094-inch bore combined with a 3.76-inch stroke. This configuration allowed oversquare architecture, bore larger than stroke, which typically benefits high RPM power. The short stroke reduced piston speed, allowing higher rev limits without excessive stress. The large bore permitted enormous valves, which meant better breathing. By late 1964, the 396 was ready for production. Chevrolet planned a mid-year introduction in the Corvette and full-size models, then expansion to the Chevelle for 1966. The engine would be offered in multiple states of tune, from the mild 325-horsepower L35 street version to the legendary 425-horsepower L78. This was Chevrolet's counterpunch. Not quite as large as the Hemi, not quite as dramatic, but available in volume, backed by the largest dealer network in America, and engineered to deliver performance that would make believers out of skeptics. Strip away the valve covers on an L78 396 and you see the revolution. Those canted valve heads are the heart of the design. Instead of mounting valves vertically in the combustion chamber, Chevrolet's engineers angled them outward. The intake valve tilted one direction, the exhaust the other. This splayed configuration, refined from the mystery motor, created room for massive valve sizes while maintaining efficient combustion chamber geometry. Think of it like this. In a traditional wedge head, valve size is constrained by the need to fit both valves into a relatively small chamber. Angle them outward and suddenly there's clearance to run intake valves over 2 inches in diameter. More valve area means more air and fuel entering the cylinder. More air and fuel means more power. The intake ports on the L78 heads measured rectangular, tall and narrow rather than round. This shape promoted high-velocity flow even at lower engine speeds, maintaining cylinder filling across the RPM range. The runners were long and smoothly transitioned, minimizing turbulence. When dyno tested in isolation, these heads flowed better than anything else in GM's arsenal at the time. The block itself was cast iron, thick-walled, and overbuilt for its displacement. 4-bolt main caps secured the center 3 main bearings, numbers 2, 3, and 4. This wasn't just about keeping the crankshaft in place. At high RPM, a 2-bolt cap can flex, allowing microscopic crankshaft movement that wears bearings and costs power. 4-bolt caps eliminated this flex entirely. The crankshaft in an L78 was forged steel, not cast iron. Forging aligns the grain structure of the metal, creating a part that's exponentially stronger than a casting. This crankshaft could withstand sustained operation at 6,500 RPM, well beyond what most street engines of the era could handle. The stroke was relatively short at 3.76 inches, which reduced piston speed and allowed those high rev limits without catastrophic piston velocity. Connecting rods were forged steel as well, with 7/16-inch bolts securing the caps. Engineers had learned from earlier failures that undersized rod bolts were a common failure point. These larger bolts provided the clamping force necessary to keep the rod and cap together under peak combustion pressure, which in an 11-to-1 compression engine running premium fuel could exceed 1,500 psi. The pistons were forged aluminum with full skirts, using 3 rings, 2 compression rings and 1 oil control ring. The top ringland was reinforced to withstand the pressure spikes that came with high compression. These weren't lightweight race pistons. These were production components designed to survive 100,000 miles of street use while still delivering race-level performance. The oil system received unusual attention. Most engines of this era used simple gear-type oil pumps that were prone to cavitation at high RPM. Chevrolet engineers designed a hydrostatic balancing system that routed oil pressure around the pump gears, equalizing forces and preventing the pump from pushing itself out of alignment. This system maintained consistent oil pressure even at sustained high engine speeds, critical for keeping bearings alive during extended racing use. The camshaft in an L78 was a mechanical flat tappet design with aggressive lift and duration. Valve lift exceeded half an inch. Duration on the intake side pushed 320 degrees. This profile created substantial valve overlap, a period when both intake and exhaust valves are open simultaneously. At low RPM, this overlap causes rough idle and poor vacuum. At high RPM, it uses pressure waves in the exhaust to help scavenge cylinders and draw fresh charge in, dramatically improving volumetric efficiency. According to period tests from Hot Rod magazine, a stock L78 396 produced peak power around 5,800 RPM. But the real story was the power curve. This engine made over 400 pound-feet of torque from 3,000 RPM all the way to 5,500 RPM. That broad, flat torque band meant brutal acceleration from any speed in any gear. The intake manifold used a 180-degree runner design. Each cylinder's runner crossed to the opposite side of the manifold. This balanced intake pulses and cylinder-to-cylinder distribution, ensuring all 8 cylinders received equal fuel and air. A single Holley 4-barrel carburetor sat on top, feeding all 8 cylinders through this carefully engineered plumbing. In testing, a properly tuned L78 produced numbers that shocked even Chevrolet's engineers. Magazines at the time reported quarter-mile times in the low 13-second range at over 105 miles per hour. But innovation always faces resistance, and the 396's breaking point was already approaching. The crisis wasn't technical. The 396 proved itself reliable, powerful, and manufacturable at scale. The crisis was political, corporate, and entirely self-inflicted. By 1969, the muscle car market was peaking. Buyers wanted more displacement, more power, more everything. Chrysler offered 440 and 426 Hemi engines in intermediate cars. Ford had stuffed 428 Cobra jets into Mustangs. Even within GM, whispers circulated about lifting the 400-inch displacement ban. But for Chevrolet, there was a more immediate problem. The 396 had become a victim of its own success. Production volumes were massive. Chevelle, Camaros, El Caminos, and Novas were leaving factories with 396 engines in unprecedented numbers. But GM's accounting division noticed something troubling in emissions certification data. The 396, with its high compression and aggressive tuning, was bumping against emission standards that were growing stricter each model year. Engineers faced a choice. They could detune the 396 to meet emissions requirements, sacrificing the performance that made it desirable, or they could find another solution. The answer came from an unexpected place: casting tolerances. Big block production occurred at Tonawanda Engine Plant in New York. During the casting process, small variations in sand core positioning would occasionally shift cylinder bores slightly off-center. This core shift meant some blocks required larger than standard bores to clean up the cylinders during machining. Blocks with significant core shift were typically scrapped or reserved for warranty replacement engines. But someone in engineering noticed that boring a 396 block point 030 inches over size increased displacement to 402 cubic inches, and 402 cubic inches fell into a different EPA emissions category, one with slightly less stringent requirements. By late 1969, the decision was made. Starting with the 1970 model year, all 396 engines would actually displace 402 cubic inches. The blocks would be bored .030 over from the factory. The stroke remained identical at 3.76 inches. Bore increased from 4.094 to 4.124 inches. The power ratings remained unchanged. The L34 396 still made 350 horsepower. The L78 396 still claimed 375 horsepower. Only the internal displacement had changed. But here's where corporate decision-making turned bizarre. Chevrolet marketing decided to keep calling it the 396, despite the engine now displacing 402 cubic inches. The reasoning was brand equity. The SS396 had become an icon. Changing the name to SS402 would confuse buyers and potentially hurt sales. So, a generation of muscle car buyers drove home in 396 Chevelle that actually had 402 cubic inch engines under the hood. The badges said 396. The dealer paperwork said 396. Even the air cleaner decals said 396. But the block stampings told a different story. Block codes with a C prefix indicated the larger displacement. A CJF block, for example, was a 350 horsepower 402. But unless you knew to look for this detail, the subterfuge was complete. This sleight of hand solved the emissions problem. It gave engineers the breathing room they needed to keep making power while meeting federal requirements. But it also created confusion that persists to this day. Online forums still debate whether specific 1970 Chevelle have real 396s or the bored-out 402s. More troubling was the signal it sent internally. If GM was willing to play games with displacement numbers to meet regulations, what did that say about the company's commitment to performance? The 396 that was actually 402 became a metaphor for Detroit's declining honesty in the muscle car era, a symptom of the compromises that would eventually kill the golden age entirely. And the 400-inch displacement limit? By 1970, GM finally lifted it. The corporation allowed 454 cubic inch engines in intermediate cars, introducing the LS6 Chevelle with 450 horsepower. The restriction that had hampered Chevrolet for 7 years evaporated overnight. The irony was savage. Just as GM freed its engineers to build truly large displacement engines, insurance rates skyrocketed, emissions standards tightened further, and buyer interest in expensive performance options began to wane. The 396 had fought its entire existence against artificial displacement limits. By the time those limits were removed, the market was already turning against big block muscle entirely. The era was ending. The 396 had won its battles but was about to lose the war. For 1971, Chevrolet officially retired the 396 name. The 402 cubic inch engine was now marketed as the Turbojet 400 in some sales literature, though some dealers and publications still called it a 396 out of habit. The L78 version, the legendary 375 horsepower solid lifter variant, vanished from the options list entirely. What remained was the LS3, a hydraulic cam version rated at 300 horsepower. This wasn't the same engine. Compression dropped from 11 to 1 to 8.5 to 1 to accommodate regular unleaded fuel. The camshaft became milder, the valve timing less aggressive. Peak power occurred at 4,800 RPM instead of 5,800 RPM. Magazine tests reflected the decline. Car and Driver tested a 1971 Chevelle with the LS3402 and recorded a 15.2-second quarter mile at 91 miles per hour. Just 2 years earlier, an L78 396 had run low 13s at over 105 miles per hour. The difference was staggering. Insurance companies had declared war on muscle cars. Young buyers faced premium increases of 50 to 100% for high-performance options. A Chevelle SS with a big block engine could cost $800 more per year to insure than an identical car with a small block. For many buyers, the math no longer made sense. Sales data told the story. In 1970, Chevrolet sold over 53,000 SS 396 Chevelle. By 1972, that number had fallen to fewer than 25,000, and most of those were equipped with the small block 350. Not the big block 402. The market was collapsing. Contemporary reviews struggled to reconcile the promise with the reality. Hot Rod magazine noted that the 1972 LS3 delivers adequate performance but lacks the urgency that made earlier 396s so memorable. Superstock and Drag Illustrated was more blunt. The party's over. Dealers found themselves sitting on inventory. Big block muscle cars that would have sold immediately 2 years earlier now languished on lots for months. Some dealers began converting unsold SS models back to base Malibu trim to move metal. The performance that had been the whole point of these cars was now a liability. Racing organizations had moved on as well. NASCAR had phased out the pure stock classes where engines like the 396 had competed. Drag racing was becoming increasingly professional, with purpose-built race cars replacing warmed-over street machines. The 396's status as a dual-purpose street and strip engine was increasingly irrelevant. Yet even in decline, the engine maintained a reputation. Mechanics who'd worked on 396s spoke reverently about their durability. The forged internals meant these engines could absorb abuse that would destroy lesser motors. Stories circulated about L78s running tens of thousands of miles at sustained high RPM without major rebuilds. Racers who'd campaigned 396-powered cars in the late 60s still talked about the handling balance. The engine's compact external dimensions, shorter and narrower than the W Series 409, made it easier to package. The weight distribution worked better than the nose-heavy 454 that replaced it. For road racing and autocross, the 396 was arguably superior to its larger sibling. Collectors hadn't yet discovered these cars. In 1972, a 5-year-old Chevelle SS 396 was just a used car, often worth less than $2,000. Nobody was preserving them. Nobody was documenting original specifications. These were transportation, not artifacts. The final production year for the 402 and passenger cars was 1972. After that, the engine lived on briefly in trucks before being discontinued entirely in favor of the 454 Total production of the Mark IV 396/402 family exceeded 635,000 units, more than the 427 and 454 combined. It had been the most popular big block Chevrolet ever built. But at the time, none of that seemed to matter. The muscle car era was over. The engines that had defined it were being replaced by emission-strangled, low-compression shadows. The 396 became just another casualty of changing times, powerful but irrelevant, respected but forgotten. The sound of those engines firing up on cold mornings was becoming rare. Drag strips saw fewer and fewer of them. Enthusiast magazines moved on to covering Corvettes and Trans Ams, the only performance cars that survived the early 70s purge. History has a habit of rediscovering what it once discarded. But in 1972, nobody could have predicted the 396's resurrection. The transformation began quietly in the late 1980s. Baby boomers who'd lusted after SS 396 Chevelles in high school were now in their 40s with disposable income and nostalgia for the cars of their youth. Values began climbing. By the mid-90s, a clean 1970 Chevelle SS 396 with the L78 engine could command $20,000. By 2010, that same car might sell for $80,000. Today, pristine examples with documented histories approach $150,000 at auction. The engine that was once considered second tier behind the 454 became a collector icon. The aftermarket responded. Companies began reproducing every component needed to restore a 396 to factory specification. You could buy reproduction intake manifolds, cylinder heads, exhaust manifolds, even correct date-coded blocks. What had been impossible to restore properly in 1985 became straightforward by 2000. More interesting was what hot rodders discovered when they began building 396s with modern technology. The short stroke and over-square configuration that had been chosen to meet 1960s displacement limits turned out to be ideal for high RPM performance. With aluminum heads, roller camshafts, and modern engine management, 396-based engines began producing 600 horsepower naturally aspirated. Add a turbocharger and 1,000 horsepower became achievable on pump gas. The architecture that engineers had created to sneak under a 400-inch limit proved remarkably adaptable to modern performance goals. The generous bore diameter accommodated large valves. The short stroke reduced friction and piston speed. The strong block with its 4-bolt mains handled boost pressures that would have seemed impossible in 1965. Enthusiast magazines began publishing comparisons. A properly built 396 could match or exceed the power output of a stock 454 at a fraction of the weight and cost. The smaller displacement meant lower rotating mass, which meant quicker acceleration and higher rev limits. Suddenly, the little big block wasn't so little anymore. The 396 influenced Chevrolet's thinking about displacement and performance. When engineers designed the LS engine family in the late 1990s, they embraced similar principles: shorter stroke, larger bore, high-flowing heads, and prioritizing efficiency over sheer cubic inches. The LS1 displaced just 346 cubic inches, yet produced 345 horsepower, numbers that would have seemed absurd in the muscle car era. The 396's legacy lived on in the philosophy that drove modern engine design. Restoration culture elevated specific variants to legendary status. The 1969 L78 Camaro, built in the final year before the transition to 402 cubes, became one of the most sought-after muscle cars. Production numbers were tiny, fewer than 400 built. Documented survivors sell for over $200,000, but the real impact is broader and more diffuse. Walk through any vintage muscle car show and count the 396-powered vehicles. They outnumber Hemis by 10 to 1. They outnumber 454s by 3 to 1. The 396 was the common man's muscle car engine, which means more people have stories about it, memories of it, connection to it. Those stories shape automotive culture. The father who bought a new Chevelle, SS 396 in 1969 and taught his son to drive in it. The teenager who saved for 2 summers to buy a used 67 with a tired 396, then spent weekends learning to rebuild it. The drag racer who campaigned an L78 Camaro in local street classes and won more than he lost. These aren't exotic supercars. These are accessible stories about accessible machines. The sound remains distinctive. Even among big block V8s, the 396 has a particular character, deeper than a small block, more mechanical than a Hemi, angrier than a 454. Exhaust note is acoustic fingerprint, and enthusiasts can identify a 396 from the tone alone. Modern engine builders still choose the 396 platform for specific applications. Its lighter weight makes it popular for road racing and autocross builds. The lower production cost makes it attractive for budget-conscious hot rodders. The strong aftermarket support means parts availability rivals modern engines. What began as a compromise, an engine designed to meet arbitrary corporate restrictions, became something greater. The 396 proved that innovation thrives under constraint, that clever engineering can turn limitations into advantages, and that the best solutions often come from working within rules rather than around them. The sound of that engine wasn't just horsepower, it was defiance cast in aluminum and iron, a middle finger to corporate bureaucracy wrapped in a package that worked better than anyone expected. Return to that dyno cell in February 1965. The journalist watching the L78 396 make its first full-power run had no idea they were witnessing an engine that would define an era, survive corporate incompetence, and influence performance design for decades. They couldn't have predicted that GM's displacement ban, intended to project corporate responsibility, would backfire so completely, costing the corporation dominance in the muscle car market it had helped create. They didn't know that the engine running before them would sell in greater numbers than any other GM big block, and they certainly couldn't have imagined collectors paying six figures for these cars 50 years later. The 396's story is ultimately about unintended consequences. GM tried to limit performance and instead created constraints that forced engineers to innovate. The 400-inch displacement cap should have been a handicap. Instead, it birthed an engine that was lighter, more efficient, and ultimately more successful than the unrestricted designs that followed. The irony cuts deeper. When GM finally lifted the ban in 1970 and allowed the 454 into intermediate cars, the market was already shifting. Insurance rates, emissions regulations, and changing buyer preferences were ending the muscle car era. The 396 had fought its entire existence against artificial limits. By the time those limits were removed, they no longer mattered. What remains is the legend. The L78 Chevelle running 13s at local drag strips, the SS396 catching a Hemi Charger by surprise on a highway on-ramp because the Chevy driver knew how to use gears, and the Mark IV's broad power band. The sound of 8 cylinders at full song pushing toward redline, defying both physics and corporate policy with every revolution. These engines taught a generation about performance, about engineering, about the satisfaction that comes from extracting maximum potential from limited resources. They demonstrated that the best solutions often emerge from constraints rather than unlimited freedom. The 396 was never supposed to be legendary. It was supposed to be a stopgap, a compromise, a way to compete without breaking rules. Instead, it became the engine that proved rules couldn't contain innovation. If you've ever driven or seen one of these machines, if you've felt that Mark IV torque hit at 3,000 RPM and carry all the way to 6,000, if you've heard that exhaust note echo off buildings on a late-night drive, share your story in the comments. These aren't museum pieces. They're living history, still being driven, still being built, still being celebrated. What began as an experiment became a legend long after the factories went quiet. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.